morning. This is Rich Sierra. I'm the president of the Florida Small Business Legal Center. Thank you for listening today. Today's episode number 37 of Business SOS Podcast. We're very excited that we continue providing you content every single week that will help your business, will help your business grow, and will help you navigate the legal landmines that you will be facing in your business through your journey. Before we begin, I'd like you to participate in the show. If you have any legal questions you'd like me to answer for you, we address in the show and in general terms, of course, please send me an email at richsierra.com. And if I select your question, I'll go ahead and send you an autographed copy of my book, Business SOS, 8 Common Legal Mistakes Business Owners Make and How to Avoid Them. It is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can ask for it as well in your local bookstore. So today I'm going to talk about commercial leases, but from a different perspective. I want to talk about it from the landlord's perspective. I have a number of clients that are landlords as well. So I thought I'd bring this topic as well. And if you're a tenant also, it's good for you to listen to this because you also could be affected as well. So it's really good for both landlords and tenants, but at the same time, in this particular case, I want to look at it from the landlord's perspective in relation to the tenants for a commercial property. So today I want to give you 5 tips to collecting rent from your business tenants. I'm going to keep it very simple today. And sometimes you have, if you're a landlord, you have commercial property, say you own a strip mall or you own a small building and you have a number of tenants that owe you, you collect rent every single month. And sometimes things happen that tenants get behind. They get behind in your rent and then they try to make it up. And then, at some point, the rent gets really past due a number of months. And then you call an attorney and say, listen, what can I do? My tenants, this particular tenant is not paying my rent every week. I need to do something about it. We need to either get him out or they have to pay. What are my options? So the first question that I asked is, can you provide me a copy of the lease? And I went over the lease agreements in prior terms, but it's important that one of the tips that I'll have for you with respect to making sure or having assurances or greater probability of collecting rent from your tenants is tenant qualification. So we'll talk about that. Let's talk about that very quickly. So you have a commercial space. As you drive through your neighborhood, you see a lot of spaces are for rent. And you have a phone number. It could be a commercial lease broker. It could be the property management company of this particular building. And they have a phone number. And the process begins there. So you have a business owner that wants to open a martial arts school in a strip mall. So what do you do in this case? So you made a phone call. So one of the things you got to make sure is that whoever you're renting to this particular space has the financial ability to pay. And business owners are very optimistic by nature, otherwise we're not going to business in the first place. And they might not have the sophistication to understand that what the financial requirements to go into business or financial requirements to go into a commercial lease, understanding what all the expenses that a commercial lease will have. So, you have to have an application for the tenant. You need to make sure that the tenant is who he is. So you have an application process, application form. You verify their IDs. You might want to ask for some financials as well, tax returns for the last 2 years, and also bank statements. And, a statement of cash to find out whether they have the ability to pay that rent in their prior experience. This is their first business that they're doing, or maybe they had already a successful business before, an ongoing business that they are going to basically move in location. And that is very important because it's a brand new business. They got to start from scratch. Meaning that they have to generate business, you got to generate revenue, they got to develop marketing. So it's going to be a little bit more of a challenge from the tenant's perspective, from that new business owner, to really generate that business, whether it's the business owner, in this particular case, I'm using a martial arts school example, already has an existing location, but perhaps it's trying to expand to another location that in your location offers more space, perhaps more parking space, a greater facility, a nicer look, a nicer feel, a more upscale area. So in that particular case, you already know there's a revenue source coming in for that business, and it's about growth. So the risk is less when it's an existing business, that ongoing business is already going to relocate, versus a business that is starting from scratch with 0 clients, 0 customers. So keep that in mind as well. So the tenant qualification, and I'm going to give you some really more highlights, some key points here, and it's not I'm not going to go into what constitute, how are you going to qualify that client, but that's really more a different conversation you can have with your accountant and with your attorney about really what criteria do I have to determine whether or not this particular tenant would be qualified to get into this particular space, and I have some assurances that that rent is going to be paid. The second item that I want to share with you is clearly defines lease terms. So we go back to the example that tenant, for some reason, thinks the business just didn't generate the revenue necessary to pay their rent, their expenses, loans, whatever the case may be. The rent began to get behind. So I asked for the lease, and I get a lease that was, drafted in 1980. And there's nothing wrong with that, but what happened, those leases get assigned. And when you have lease assignments, sometimes you need to make sure that you have the original lease that you have on that particular property, but you got to have every single assignment up to the one that the tenant signed in order to see that chain of tenants that went through that property. Because in order for you to enforce that particular lease, you need to make sure that you have that particular tenant has the current lease or the assigned lease. And I see it sometimes in smaller businesses or a sole proprietorship that or a small LLC or a business that maybe has a strip mall, and then the leases have not been updated. They have been inherited from prior owners that they just bought the building, and those leases just don't get updated. Sometimes the documents are missing, and you cannot basically connect the dots. So that's important to have that, clearly defined terms in the lease. So you have an old lease, nothing wrong with it, just to make sure that's the lease that is operational. That's the one that we have to work with. So if it's a brand new lease, if you have a current lease, then the terms of the lease are very important. Clearly, I will look, okay, how much is the base rent? What is the CAM, the maintenance, utilities, the annual increases, insurance, and how much is that tenant behind by? What is the amount that a tenant owes? And as a landlord, you have a number of options to enforce that lease. One thing that I look for is there a personal guarantee on that lease. And in most cases, with very, very few exceptions, when we're talking about small businesses, the landlord will require a personal guarantee from that tenant. So I'll look at what is the personal guarantee that you have. And also I want to find out what type of security deposit do you have. So I'll look at all that information, and usually you have a number of steps. The goal is for have the tenant to pay. So you got to start with the approach, talk to the tenant, say what's going on, what's happening here, and get the information necessary to find out whether this is a short-term scenario or it's going to be something that is not curable. So in my experience, if some communication goes a long way. Sometimes there is a shortfall in revenue for whatever reason, low sales, but there's a season coming up that's going to expect an increase in revenue, say the holidays or depending what type of business there is, talking to martial arts schools. So they'll pick up business when school begins because kids come back from the summer and then they go back to schools, they go back to their routine. So it's an increase in enrollment in this case. So a number of things you can do as a landlord. You can go ahead and say, okay, what we're going to do is do an amendment, do an accommodation. If you like this tenant, you want to keep this tenant, it happens to something that it was more of a one-time thing, that more of an exception, it's been a good tenant for you, you can just make an accommodation and say, okay, I want to take the part that is behind, okay, I can basically spread it out. But beginning this particular month, you're going to start paying this plus the amount that you owe. So you can make an accommodation. However, if you make an accommodation to that tenant, you got to do it in writing. I recommend that you do this in writing and basically do an amendment to the lease so it's reflected on the lease agreement. It's for your protection and also for the tenant's protection. Number two, if it looks like this is not going to be cured and it's just, your options are you have to get the tenant out because you're losing revenue, they're continue operating, and right now you cannot lease that property because there's a tenant in the space, but the tenant's not paying your rent, then you have more. The statute Florida statute gives you some options that you have. You can have what is called a 3-day notice to cure, to pay or vacate, and that's something that an attorney would draft for you, should draft for you. You can do it, obviously, but an attorney should do it for you. And then you serve that to the tenant and you post it on their door. And they have 3 days to cure the provisions of the amount that they owe you, or they have to vacate the premises. So it puts a lot of pressure on that tenant in order to cure that default. It's a notice of default. And they have 3 days to cure, or they have to leave. Say they don't leave. They don't leave and they don't pay. The next step is that you have the option to do a complaint, do a lawsuit for possession of the premises. And you file a lawsuit through an attorney. You file it in court. It gets served. Under the Florida statute, there are 5 days. You can file what is called summary proceedings. And they have 5 days. In 5 days, if they don't answer that complaint, you can actually have an order from the court taking possession of the premises. It's a very, very fast process. So that is a very extreme scenario, but you have that option to do so. And of course, the lawsuit would also include damages for the amount that they owe you for the remaining balance of the lease as well. So that is another option that you have as the landlord. But what is key here is that you're going to have a clearly defined terms in the lease, because your attorney is going to look at that lease and to be able to enforce it. So the clearly defined terms in the lease are important. If it's not very clear, then you're going to have an issue. But it's important to have clearly defined terms, at least that you can enforce. Now, another scenario here is that what if there's a dispute on the rent? That you have a situation that they're paying rent, but they're not paying the increases that they were agreed upon. And there's a discrepancy, there's a disagreement as to how much the increase should be. In this particular case, you still can take those steps of sending the 3-day notice to pay or vacate, but if they start paying their rent, but they don't cure that particular amount of the default, you still can file the lawsuit for possession of the premises or vacate. They have 5 days to answer. But say they answer and they say, we're paying the correct amount that they're disputed rents. This particular case, the court will have a hearing, and the judge can order that tenant to pay the disputed rents into the court registry until the dispute is resolved. They want to make sure that the law, basically the statute wants to make sure that you as the landlord are getting paid, or some money is getting paid into the court registry, to make sure that the tenant is not using the space without getting without paying the rent. So there's some options that you have as the landlord. But everything begins with a clearly defined lease that is actually for your benefit. So tenant qualification, number one, clearly defined lease terms. Number two, number three, no verbal agreements. I've had situations where sometimes, tenants are behind, and then they tell me, you know what? I said, what happened? My landlord sent me this letter to leave, and I'm like, but what happened here? You got behind. You're obviously behind in the lease. You haven't paid for 6 months. He told me to pay half. The landlord told me to pay half, and it's okay. And I'm like, but you have it in writing? No. It's important to have not to make verbal agreements and lease agreements. They're not binding. So if you're going to make an accommodation, you're going to have an amendment to the lease. You're going to have a change in terms, especially in payments. Do it in writing and don't make verbal agreements. Do an amendment to the lease. Renewal terms. That's number 4. Every lease has an expiration date. So clearly, if somebody wants to renew the lease and they're not paying you on time, you're not going to renew that lease. So one of the terms that you have to have that I recommend having in your renewal terms in your lease is that the lease must be current and in good standing in order to renew that lease, especially if you provide what is called an option to renew. Option to renew is that the tenant has the option, provided they give you a notice that is in the lease, could be 3 months, could be 90 days, could be 6 months, whatever the case may be, that to say, we want to renew for another 3 years, want to renew for another 5 years. So in this particular case, you can have a provision there said, provided the lease is in good standing and is current, you may exercise this option. Otherwise, you as the landlord have the option not to allow that option to be exercised because you do not want to have a tenant that does not pay you rent. That's the reason you are billed. Your owner of a commercial property is for you to be able to collect rent in a timely fashion and provide a space for businesses to be able to operate and thrive. But at the same time, you have obligations. You have to maintain the building. You have insurance obligations. You have a lot of property taxes. So having a tenant operating in your building without paying is basically creating more of a double burden on you because somebody's generating revenue, creating risk for your space because every time there's somebody in your building, there's always risk. At the same time, you're not getting paid your proportionate share of your revenue. So the renewal terms are very important. You can use that as leverage. You like the space, you just got to pay on time. And last but not least, it's the strict compliance with the lease enforcement. That's very important. You have a number of options to enforce your lease. It is important not to deviate. Although most commercial leases, the ones that I draft, there's also a provision that there's not a waiver. If you decide not to exercise a certain provision of the lease, doesn't mean you have waived the right to do it. So it is important that you follow the strict compliance with the terms of the lease. And this is really more of kind of an overview, a big picture perspective. I'll give you 5 tips to ensure that you're getting paid by your tenants. That's the reason you're an owner of a commercial property. But it's not constitute a very in-depth analysis or in-depth discussion of what goes into a commercial lease. It's not an in-depth discussion of how to enforce a lease because every lease is different. But you have to, the statute speaks for itself, Chapter 83, Florida. And it gives you, it's really a pro-landlord statute. And that's good news for you as the landlord. So the statute really gives you a lot of tools available at your disposal to be able to enforce it. But at the end of the day, this is also a business relationship. So if you're able to provide or work with the tenant to help to pay the lease and make some minor accommodation, then it's easier to do that if possible versus trying to vacate the place, clear it out, empty the space, clean it up, put it assigned for rent, or advertise it in a LoopNet, or get a commercial broker, real estate broker, and try to find another tenant and begin the process all over again. So then I still have one more point that I want to share with you. This also applies for assignments. Say, for example, one of your tenants is selling his or her business. It happens. In fact, I do a number of those transactions every month. So what's going to happen is that the tenant is going to work a different transaction, a letter of intent or an asset purchase agreement with the prospective buyer. So the tenant is going to come to you and say, listen, I'm selling my business. What should I do? So in this particular case, you go through the process. Again, it's easier. In this case, you already have a tenant paying you rent. So in this case, you basically ask for the prospective buyer to contact you and to do the qualification. The tenant qualification is very important. You have an option in this case as the landlord, whether you want to have this lease assigned to this buyer or you want to have a brand new lease. And in most commercial leases, there's a lease assignment provision that the landlord has the right to, has to approve the assignment of the lease, and that the assignment will not be unreasonably withheld. There might be a cost to that for the tenant. Sometimes in the lease, it said you got to pay a certain amount to cover the cost of your attorney, of the landlord's attorney, to prepare the documents, but also some preparation and some qualification about doing the due diligence on that buyer, on that new prospective tenant, as to whether or not that tenant will be qualified. So those are the things as well, but the same process is the same. Tenant qualification, clearly defined lease, no verbal agreements, look at the renewal terms, and strict compliance with the lease. Enforcement, those are 5 tips that I want to share with you. And this also applies when the lease is going to be assigned to somebody else, whether somebody's taking over the business or somebody who's going to be buying that business that is in your property. So I want to leave you with that today. And if you have any questions about whether you're a landlord or a tenant, and you're one or the other, one of the two, unless you, in this case, if you have any questions about commercial leases, feel free to send me an email at richsierra.com. If you want to learn more about the legal services that we provide, our website is floridasmallbusinesslegalcenter.com. We're in Facebook at FSB Legal. If you want to watch the video of this podcast, we're at youtube.com/@RichardSierra. We're on X at Rich_Sierra. We're on Instagram at FSB Legal. If you want to give us a call, number is 866-842-5202. Remember that Business SOS, 8 Common Legal Mistakes business owners making, how to avoid them. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It's available also, you can ask for any local bookstores. And I do in the book, I go through a specific section on commercial leases as well. And in prior podcasts, there's actually more in-depth discussion on commercial leases. You want to go back to some of those episodes. Remember to follow us, follow the podcast. Our subscribers continue to grow. Share it with your friends. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you enjoy your shows. If you're watching us today via YouTube, please subscribe your channel. If you have any comments, please I'll check them and I'll answer myself. It'll be helpful to have that information, that feedback from you. Until next week, this is Rich Sierra. Remember that my goal is to help you succeed.